Alright, this is just a quick transition lesson for you about topic 10.8, the Haitian Revolution. I'm just recording this just in case I can't be there in person to go through this with you. We've just gone through the Enlightenment, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution is a natural outgrowth of this. The question we're looking at here is, if the Enlightenment says all men are born free, right, with natural rights, does that apply to enslaved people too? This seems obvious to us today, but in the Enlightenment, there were people who saw this as less obvious as we would today, let's just say. So the answer, of course, is obviously yes. If all men are born with natural rights, then this applies to everyone, including people who are born to enslavement. But if that is true, then what happens to the entire economic plantation system in the Americas? That's what we're going to be looking at today, the consequences of this in the Americas, and the plantation system that all of these colonies were built on. So this is topic 10.8, the Haitian Revolution. The goal here is for you to be able to defend a claim about the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, a famous figure in the Haitian Revolution. The Enlightenment, you'll remember, in the French Revolution created a powerful new idea, the idea of liberty and equality for all people. In Haiti, enslaved people decided those ideas, well, they applied to them too, which is very accurate, right? But this would terrify the slave societies across the Americas. And if you stop and think for a second, you'll understand why it would be terrifying to them. They were drastically outnumbered, and their entire way of life, their entire wealth, was based on the idea of enslaving people, the idea that people don't have liberty, and people are not equal. So you have the economic interests of plantation owners at odds with the noble goals of liberty and equality from the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment philosophers, they were way ahead of their times, right? They were revolutionary, literally, as they were challenging the idea of absolute monarchs. But there are people who argue, was the Enlightenment meant to free enslaved people? Was the ending of slavery part of the goals of the Enlightenment? And this is what made the Haitian Revolution so important. The Enlightenment itself created ideas that were far more powerful than the people who invented them ever expected these ideas to be, right? These are the unintended consequences of spreading the ideas of liberty and equality and freedom. Timeline-wise, if we're looking at our, timeline of revolutions here, each dot here represents 25 years. You can see the Enlightenment is kind of this period right here from the early 1700s to the late 1700s is generally considered the period of the Enlightenment when these philosophers were writing. You can see that right at the tail end, you start seeing these revolutions pop off as they'd spent 50 years writing about these ideas. The revolution in the Americas, the revolution in France, and you can see right here, this is the French Revolution. Right next to it on the timeline, right here, is the Haitian Revolution. They're actually overlapping with each other and happening at the same time. The Enlightenment had become a dangerous idea at this point. During the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, terrorized the people of France as people were using these ideas but putting a lot of violence behind them. The American Revolution had shown that hierarchies can be turned upside down, and so there's a lot to be learned from this moment. The American Revolution and the French Revolution both showed that new government systems were possible. Some of them would be more successful than others, and some would just be recreating what had happened in the past. In 1789, the French Revolution overthrew their absolute monarchy and tried to create a republic based on the ideas of the Enlightenment, much like in the way that the United States did. But that got bloody pretty fast, and America watched on in horror, not knowing what to do, which side to take. This leads us into the Haitian Revolution. The Caribbean Sea was the source of a lot of European wealth, especially the colony of Saint-Domingue, right here. Today we got Saint-Domingue and Santo Domingo, two parts of the same island called Hispaniola. Haiti is now the western part of this. But this was the most valuable plantation site in the world at that time, and it was controlled by the French Empire. The source of this wealth was sugarcane, as these plantations were primarily growing sugar to feed the sweet tooth of the Europeans at the time. They were growing other things like coffee as well, but primarily sugar was the thing that they were after. And since the work was hard and dangerous, people didn't want to do it themselves, so Europeans instead continued to turn to the Atlantic slave trade. And you can see here that slave trade was extremely profitable for the people who were doing it, right? This is despicable, horrible work, but you see that people have this economic incentive to take part of it, because if you purchase someone, an enslaved person on the west coast of Africa in 1748, you would spend 14 pounds on it. That's a British currency. But in the same year, if you get that person over, you kidnap them and you sell them into the Caribbean islands, the plantations in the Caribbean, you could sell that same person for $32. That's a huge profit for a despicable, horrible, evil act. By 1768, you saw that it was even more profitable, as it cost you 16 pounds to buy an enslaved person and kidnap them and take them overseas. But then when you kidnap them and take them overseas to the Caribbean, to these islands, to these plantations, you could sell that person for 41 pounds. So you see the perverse economic incentives at play here. For reference, 1 pound in 1768 would be worth about $200 in about 2024 dollars. So all this wealth in the slave trade is driven by the wealth that can be generated by the plantation system on these islands, very similar to the plantation system that you're probably familiar with from the American South from your U.S. history classes. Now, the Caribbean, Haiti doesn't start out as a plantation island. Instead, it starts out as a pirate hub where different pirates hired by the English and other Western European powers basically hired these pirates to attack Spanish ships in order to get access to the gold and silver and other resources the Spanish were extracting from their colonies in the early days of the Age of Exploration. Eventually, this island transitions to coffee and sugar plantations, requiring 40,000 newly enslaved people every year because so many of them die from the brutal conditions. There were four main groups of people on the island of Haiti at the time of the Haitian Revolution. At the top of the social hierarchy were the white planters. Below them were wealthy, free people of color. Below them were the poor white people, and at the bottom were enslaved people. So the social hierarchy is a little different from what you would have seen, say, in the American South of plantations, where poor white people would be above anyone of color, and there really wouldn't be any wealthy, free people of color. During the French Revolution, enslaved people far outnumbered all others on the island of Haiti. You can see here this graph right here. By the time of the French Revolution kicking off, there were about 40,000 white people, 30,000 free black people, and 500,000, 500,000 enslaved people on the island. And most of these enslaved people died within 3 years of arriving, which meant most of these 500,000 people were newly enslaved. They were captured in Africa, kidnapped in Africa, and shipped overseas in terrible conditions, so they remembered freedom. This was not, thinking back to their parents or their grandparents. This was literally their own lives. Within just a few years, within 2 years of arriving on this island, they had been a free and independent person living in a different civilization in Africa. Now, this is where we're going to enter the story of Toussaint Louverture. His full name is Francois Dominique Toussaint Louverture, but most of us just call him Toussaint Louverture or Louverture. Now, the Haitians were led by him during the Revolution. He was kind of like the George Washington figure of the Haitian Revolution. He was born enslaved in the 1740s, so he wasn't born over in Africa. He was actually born to an enslaved woman in the 1740s, and he was taught how to read and write by his godfather. Eventually, he did get freedom from his slave master. This was actually not that uncommon, right? You could essentially slave masters would free their enslaved people, or you could do a lot of side work by renting yourself out to other people. Again, this is absolutely terrible, but you can earn some money this way on top of the things you were forced to do as a slave, and then use that money to eventually purchase your freedom, which is kind of what happens with Toussaint Louverture. Now, after he becomes free, he begins to rent a small coffee plantation. So he has some land of his own that he's renting, and in order to make money on this plantation, he actually purchases about a dozen or so enslaved people himself. So again, fairly complicated figure. He's not this revolutionary that you would like him to be, at least in the sense of being a staunch abolitionist, being strongly against slavery. In fact, he was born into slavery, but then when he became free, he made his wealth by enslaving others, which again paints him as a very complicated figure. By 1789, when the French Revolution kicks off and it reaches the colony of Haiti, the enslaved people of the island are demanding the same thing the French people were demanding: equality, liberty, and brotherhood. Robespierre, as you might remember from the French Revolution, even called for the end of slavery, and these ideas were reaching Haiti. They were being brought over by the news. Remember, Haiti was part of the French Empire. Toussaint, during these early days of the rebellion, emerged as a leader of it. He even encouraged revolts against slave masters, despite the fact that he was a slave master at the time himself. It's during this revolution he raises a rebel army of about 4,000 troops to fight off the French armies who came to kind of put down the rebellion. By 1794, France agreed to end all slavery in the colonies because of this rebellion, and Toussaint pledges loyalty back to the French Republic, because at this time the monarchy has been destroyed and they're operating as a republic based on the ideals of the Enlightenment, but they're also in the reign of terror at this point. So he becomes the appointed leader of the army on the island because he pledged loyalty to the new French Republic. In 1802, this figure, Napoleon Bonaparte, has kind of seized control of the French Empire at this point. The French Republic is no longer really a republic. He is a emperor, he calls himself, and he decides that he's going to launch an invasion of the island because he wants to bring back slavery because he needs the plantation money to pay for his wars in North America and Europe that he plans on fighting to expand the French Empire even further. Toussaint, well, he pledged loyalty to the French Republic, but this is no longer really the French Republic. So he leads the resistance and beats back the French army despite the leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte. Eventually, the French trick him and capture him by saying, hey, we want to talk to you and negotiate. But instead of negotiating, they arrest him and throw him in jail where he dies of pneumonia. Unfortunately, he did not live long enough to see Haiti gain independence on January 1st, 1804, but it's at that time that Haiti becomes a free and independent republic run by formerly enslaved people. This is the first time in history this has ever happened. And remember, the American Revolution was just a decade or so before this, and it was in America, the newly crowned Republic of America is highly dependent on slave labor in the South. And now you got an island just south of that where the enslaved people rose up, rebelled, and created their own republic independent of any empire. So this leaves us with a complicated question. How should history remember Toussaint Louverture? He was born a slave, gained his freedom, became a slave master, then rose through the ranks to become the leader of the Haitian Revolution, which led to a free and independent republic run by the people who were formerly enslaved, only to become a dictator on the island. So he is a very complex person, and we're going to be looking at some documents, or you'll be looking at some documents, analyzing them, to try to come to a decision to have a claim that you can defend about how history should remember this very complicated yet important figure. The first document you're going to look at is an analysis of the timeline of abolition in Saint-Domingue. That is, a timeline showing the order of events that happened led to the end of slavery in Haiti. Next, you'll be looking at a document, a primary source, of a letter written by Toussaint to the French Directory, that is the vaguely democratic government that replaced the French monarchy during the Reign of Terror. Then you'll be moving on to looking at the Constitution of Haiti, or the Saint-Domingue Constitution. This is before they changed the name to Haiti. That was signed and very much heavily influenced by the ideas of Toussaint. Then you'll go on to another primary source, another writing of Toussaint, his proclamation of November 25th, 1801, where you start to see him start to move away from democratic ideals and more back toward a dictatorship. And after you've analyzed all this, you're going to use the evidence from these documents to be able to defend a claim about how history should remember this very complex figure. Remember, there's no quote-unquote right or wrong answer about how history should remember him, as long as you can back up that opinion with facts and explain how those facts back up your claim. In the end, the reason we should remember the Haitian Revolution is because for the first time in history, enslaved people have successfully overthrown their masters and taken over. This will be inspiration to enslaved Africans all across the Americas, including in the United States. It will force Napoleon Bonaparte, who we're going to look a lot more at in our next lesson, and France to abandon dreams of an empire in the Americas and instead focus on a European empire. It also shows the complex legacy of slavery, which is never as clear-cut as we always want it to be, right? History is always more complicated. And finally, when we didn't talk about it, American and European empires will spend the next century trying to isolate it from trade with the rest of the world in order to set it up for failure, because they did not want to have a successful republic run by formerly enslaved people in the Caribbean. That it might be an inspiration to the people who were enslaved on their plantations. And Haiti is still dealing with the fallout from these policies to this very day. But this isn't a modern history class, so we're not going to focus on that. Instead, what I want you focusing on is analyzing those documents and being able to defend a claim about how history should remember the George Washington of Haiti, Toussaint Louverture.